Children's Church, you're dismissed if you're a third grade and down. All right, we're going to pick up a little bit where we left off last week, the second half of this sermon dealing with the last miracle that Jesus performs before the greatest miracle that Jesus performs. If you'd bow your heads with me, let's open with a word of prayer. And Lord, we just want to approach you today humbly, asking, Lord, that your word would speak to us, that it would give us insight into your character and your heart, and that it in turn would give us strength to live in this world with love, because we have hope and faith in what you're going to accomplish. We thank you again for this miracle, and I just pray, Lord, that it would speak to our hearts even all these years later. All right, so the pain of love, part 2. All right, the way if is used. If is like a super small word, but yet it is so influential and so incredibly important. It's probably the first way that we learn to interact with the world, because it's one of the first ways that we start to understand cause and effect. You remember being little and being told, if you eat your vegetables, I heard somebody over here, then you can have your dessert, right? If statements. And they're super important. And the Bible is filled with ifs, lots and lots of ifs. And in the New Testament, there's like 540 ifs or something like that. You can look them all up if you got nothing better to do, or you can just take my word for it. And half of those ifs are used by Jesus. So again, the Gospels, he uses if a lot, and he uses if in two basic ways. The first way we see him using the word if is it is nearly always placed on the side of the human. If we do something, then God will continue. It is almost never used of if God does something, then. Because why? Why is the if put on the human side and not on the divine side? Because God doesn't work in ifs. He is absolute. He knows all things. He has a place that he's going. And so the if is contingent on us. Almost always the if is, if you hear these words of mine and put them into practice, then something happens. The one we just read, the vine passage. If you hear these things, if you do what I say, then these things will happen. If you have the faith the size of a mustard seed, then you can tell this mountain to move and it will. An if statement. Or at the very end in Revelation chapter 3, if you hear my voice and my knocking on your door and you let me in, then I will come in and eat with you and you with me. The if statements are always calling us to take what God says seriously and apply it to real life. So that's the first way we see the word if in the Bible. If is used that way an awful lot. But there's another way that if is used. It's meant to activate faith. It's meant for us to believe what God says and then do what God says. But the second way is if is sometimes used to alter the unalterable. And we use if that way a lot. If only. How many of us are the if only people, right? Something happened, it didn't go the way we really wanted, and what's the first thing? It's like, if only. And then where does our mind run with the if onlys? Down an alternate path that can never be. And we can spend a lot of our time thinking about if only statements. If only I had taken that job. If only I hadn't taken that job. If only I got that first date. If only I hadn't got that first date. If only I had, and then we just run. And we're going to see that kind of if in today's text as well in John chapter 11. The if only statements. So we're going to see the if you have your faith in me statements, and then we're going to have the alternative, the if only statements. And Jesus is going to really encourage one and downplay the other in our lives. Because the if onlys can end up wasting our lives away. I am a moderate Harry Potter fan, so for those of you who either A, it's like behind you, or B, you don't like it, that's fine. I'm up here, you have no control. In the first book, Harry Potter is an orphan, and he's stuck at his school, and everyone has gone home except for himself. And he finds this mirror. It's called the Mirror of Erised, which if you put it backwards, is the Mirror of Desire. And it's the if-only mirror, basically. You see what you wish would be. And he ends up spending the entire Christmas break looking into this mirror. And what does he see? He sees his life if his parents hadn't been taken from him. He sees an if-only. And the wise Dumbledore, who in many ways represents the church, if you take my view of Harry Potter, he comes before Harry and he says, many people have wasted away looking at this mirror, not knowing if what they have seen is real or even could be. And by doing that, Dumbledore encourages Harry to let go of the if-onlys and live with where you are. And Jesus is going to do something very similar in this text. to move us away from the if-onlys and move into the if you have faith, then statements. Okay, and with having said that, we all live with if every day. It's a huge part of who we are. And so the encouragement today would be to live with the correct if in our minds when struggles and trials come along. Now, having said all this layout, I now want to read the second half of John chapter 11. It's a little long, so bear with me. But if you have your Bibles, please open them to John chapter 11 and stand with me if you would. And we'll start in verse 17. And I want you to notice as we read through this text, the different ifs. And you'll see them, I think, pretty clearly. And I'll try to cough or put an emphasis on the ifs as they appear. All right, so just to kind of catch us all up, Jesus has heard the news that Lazarus is sick. He decides to wait extra days, and now we're going to jump into his actual appearance. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, here's our first if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she told him. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world. And after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at a place where Martha had met him. When Jesus, who had been with Mary in the house, comforted her, noticed how quickly when the Jews in the house with Mary noticed how she got up so quickly and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to mourn them. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Our second if. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there for 4 days. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you, our third if, that if you believe, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you have sent me. When he said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, take the grave clothes off and let him go. May God bless the reading of his word. You may be seated. A long text. A lot happens in it. I'm going to try to emphasize just the right points for today's time. Our first thing we're going to take a look at is this love's willingness to suffer emotionally. You remember last week we looked at love was willing to suffer risk, because for Jesus to even show up in Bethany was to put himself in the crosshairs. And his disciples tell him that, and he recognizes that. And Mary and Martha know what they're asking when they say, will you please come heal our brother? Because if he shows up near Jerusalem, the last time he was there, they tried to stone him to death and basically said, and if we see you again, we're going to finish the job we started. And so Jesus enters into this risky place, but he's going to do something unique. He's going to risk more than just his life. He's risking, in a sense, deep emotional pain. And he's going to enter into deep emotional pain. So he's there 4 days late, like we talked about last week. He's there 4 days late, and he's going to encounter Mary and Martha. And I want you to notice what they say. Their words are almost identical. If you had been here, this would not have happened. They're living in the if only. If only you had shown up sooner, if only you hadn't missed the train to get to Bethany, my whole world would be so much better off. And in one sense, the thing this text shows us is if God would answer our prayers the way we prayed them, we may get what we want, but we would not end up getting what we really need. They didn't necessarily need just to have Lazarus back in their life. They needed to know and believe in the glory of God. And if he just would have healed Lazarus, that would have been great, but it would have missed the bigger picture, and it would have missed the bigger point that he really, really, really wants his disciples to understand. So he does not, in a sense, listen to or abide with their request. He gives them something much more that they didn't even know that they were really asking for. And Jesus, many times, does that with us. But the cool thing we see about Jesus is his interactions with them. He doesn't give them the same answer. He works in the midst of grief and suffering uniquely to the person. All right, so we're introduced to Martha first, and we've seen Martha before. Many of you know the story where Martha's like cooking and baking in the back, and Mary's like listening at the feet of Jesus, and she gets all bent out of shape. Who are my Marthas? Who are my type A's? Driven, logical, go-getters. We don't sit still very well. If you notice, she hears Jesus is on the way, and what does she do? She doesn't wait for him to get there. She's like, and she's just out the door, right? And she's just beeline straight to Jesus, and that is one of the things that's unique about her, right? And many people are the type A Marthas. We identify with her. I am one of those types of people. So I yes, you see a problem, you feel the need to resolve it right away. And then, you'll think about the consequences of your choices later. So she beelines it right to him, and what does Jesus give her? He gives her instruction. He gives her a theologically more rounded idea than she currently had. So he's like, do you believe your brother's going to come back? And what's her answer? She gives the standard Bible answer. Yes, at the end of time. I believe at the end of time, everyone's going to be resurrected. And Jesus doesn't say, no, that's wrong. But he says there's something more going on than what even you know. Because Jesus is going to say something profound, right? He gives one of his, if you're familiar with John, one of the I am statements of John. So if you're familiar with that phrasing, that is taking from the book of Exodus, the sacred covenant name of God in heaven, the Lord. And he says, I am the resurrection and the life. He uses that language, which by this point, his disciples are not sure what that all means, but they're used to him saying that. But he's saying, I am the Lord. I am the resurrection and the life. And he noticed the connection here. He's saying resurrection and then life. And then if you're not careful, we look at this text and we're like, oh, he's talking about Lazarus. Lazarus is going to be resurrected and then there's going to be life. But that would actually miss the bigger point that Jesus is trying to communicate. What's he really saying? Upon my resurrection, then all people have the opportunity to have life. And so he's using this picture of Lazarus to show the world the truth about himself. And again, Martha didn't understand all of this. No Jew, no Greek, no Roman believed that there would be resurrection in the middle of history. Like some people believe there could be a resurrection in the future judgment or something. But the idea of a person coming back to life after being dead for 4 days was as foreign of an alien concept to Martha as it is to us. We would not expect it. And she's not expecting it. Jesus has raised people from the dead, but up until this point, they've been dead a few hours by the time Jesus gets there. Not 4 days, not rotting and decaying in a cave. That had never been done before. And you think about the resurrections, or we would call them resuscitations of the Old Testament, same scenario. They've been dead a couple hours, maybe, and they're brought back. Not this story. Jesus makes it a point to get there so late that Lazarus is molding and dying, or he's dead already, decaying in a cave somewhere. And so she has no anticipation. But then she's like, but I also believe that you're the Son of God and you can do whatever you want. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And he says, and you're going to see something pretty amazing today. And she had no idea. And you know what the crazy thing is? That's enough for her. She's going through grief. She has lost probably the most important person in her life, her brother, because her parents seemingly are passed away by this point. And she's resolved. She's happy. She's like, okay, I got the answer I needed from Jesus. I understand what he wants me to do. And she goes back home. How many of you would not be satisfied with that upon the death of a loved one? And yet, in this case, her faith is tied to Jesus and his instruction. You could say his word, and she's believing. And she goes back home, and she has peace with who Christ is. She doesn't know what he's going to do, but she's okay with that. And then she does what most of us would do. She tells her sister, the rabbis here, the teachers here. And this kind of gives us a bit of a picture of Jesus, and what made him unique at his time is he had a lot of women disciples who followed him. And Mary and Martha were two of those disciples. You know, our NIV translates it teacher. The word is rabbi. And he's like, the rabbi is here. And this part didn't strike me until this time. I forget who I was talking to. Somebody was like, I need to feel pursued. And when I don't feel pursued, I don't feel loved. And what does Mary need? She needs to know that Jesus is asking about her. Notice what Martha says. The teacher is asking about you. And then what does Mary do? She hops up and she runs to Jesus, throws herself at his feet, which in the story of Mary is always where she is. And every time Mary shows up in the Bible, she's at the feet of Jesus. She's at his feet when he's teaching. She's at his feet right here when she's lost her brother. And when she breaks open the nard, the super expensive perfume, and pours it on Jesus' feet, she's at his feet. That is her role. That is her place. And she is about as opposite of Martha as you could possibly get. Right? Does she want a theological answer? No. And does Jesus give her a theological answer? No. What does he do when she shows up weeping? He wept. He emotes with her. He feels her pain. He knows that she does not need what Martha needed. And he gives Mary what Mary needed. And what Mary needed was the hand around her saying, I'm here and I care and I feel what you're going through. And the crazy thing is, Jesus knew what he was going to do, and yet he still joins her in her sorrow. He weeps with her. He feels deep emotion because she's feeling deep emotion. And we're going to see his emotion goes even beyond sadness, which we'll get to in just a minute, because he cared. Martha, he gives instruction. Mary, he gives sympathy. Martha, he tells her what she needs to know to kind of resolve the problem in her mind. And with Mary, he gives her a hug and says, I'm here. And he asks about her. And for maybe some of you in here, it's important to know that Jesus, in a sense, asks about you. He doesn't coddle her, right? He doesn't be like, poor baby or something. He's not emotionally distant either. He is very much involved, and he's also going to bring her to a deeper level of faith. Because again, she's living in the if only. If only you'd been here. Everything would be resolved. Everything would be great. And here we get, I think, maybe a thought for us. The ways that Jesus responds to grief and the ways that we respond. Okay, one of the things that I think most of us do is if you respond to suffering and you're like a cognitive, rational thought kind of person, when another person is suffering in your life, what do you lean into? The right answers. And is there a place for that? Absolutely, there's a place for that. But if you're like me and the right answers are what you want to say, that's not what everybody needs. And so what do we sometimes have to work on if we're the Martha types? Just being quiet, being still, and being there. Right? And if you're the Martha type, you can emote with people, you can feel their pain, you can hug them, you can cry with them. What's the struggle that you have with sharing answers for them? Because again, people need more than just a hug sometimes. They need to have a grounding for hope and for faith. And so if you're the Mary type, sometimes we struggle with, do I have the right words? And what if I say the wrong thing? What if I actually make the situation worse rather than better? And so instead of saying something, what do? Say nothing. And I just want you to notice here, we see two truths, I think, that are helpful for us. The first is this. It is central that we operate in community. Because we have Marthas in this room, and we have Marys in this room. We can relate to people differently, and we need that. We need the community of believers to encourage us in the ways that we need. Because again, no one person, except for Jesus, can really help a person suffer completely. We need a community for that when we go through trials. And yet at the same time, there's a call for us to be individually like Jesus. So if you're the quick to give a theological response, all things work together for the good of those who love him, we need to be more like Jesus sometimes and be like, I just got to weep with you. I just got to sorrow with you and not give you the theological response. And if you're quick to put your arm around a person and give them the support they need, then maybe the other side of that is we need to know his word so that we know what to say when they're going through those trials. Because there has to be words of truth, again, to ground the emotions. Otherwise, we just sorrow with no hope. And we need hope in the midst of suffering. And that is one of the amazing things we see in Jesus, is that he is, in a sense, the complete sufferer. He can suffer completely with people. And as a body of believers, we're called to the same. We're called to take what Jesus gives us and do the things he's called us to do. And again, use our gifts, use our talents, but also to become more well-rounded. And we see that in the person of Jesus. So which way comes more naturally for you? Which one is more you? And what would Jesus want you to do with the flat side of that for you? So is it a pause on the words when someone suffers? Or maybe it's an encouragement when you're with a person and you're like in the back of your mind, there's a verse and you're like, I don't know if I can say it. What if it comes across harsh? Or what if I don't say it right? Maybe the movement is of the Spirit in your life. Speak when the truth of God's word would help this person see the bigger picture. Because that's what Jesus is going to do. Now, we get to Jesus here doing another thing. There we are. He cries. He weeps, and it's more than that. He's angry. It says he's troubled. It uses the word that he's moved in his spirit. It's the same word used of war horses going off to battle. Because something's happening here. He's seeing the effects of sin in the world. And he's not just sad about it. He's hurt and angry about it. And one of the things that's so unique is that in the Greek understanding of the world, and in a lot of understanding of the world today, the gods did not care about humanity. The word apathy was used for them. The reason why they didn't care about humanity is if you care about a subject or a person or a creature, then they have some kind of influence on you. What I'm about to say gets a little bit dicey, but bear with me for a minute. What we see in the person of Jesus is God himself is moved by our suffering. We have an impact on the heart of God. Because if you are emotionless, then people who are in your life and are experiencing emotion have no impact on you. And that's how the Greeks thought of the gods. They don't care about you. They can't care about you. Because if they care about you, then they could be changed by you. And we know that an all-powerful, unchanging God can't change. And yet, as we talked about last week, at the center of the nature of God is love. And we have this very strange, and I have to be careful to treading, a very strange paradox. Is God unchanging and all-powerful and has a will that can't be stopped? Does the Bible teach that principle? Everywhere. Does God care about you and listens to your prayers and is moved by his people? Yes. And how do we hold that intention? I don't know how exactly, but we have to. And we see it here. Because Jesus is going to respond to them, but he also has his own agenda. And he's moved. And so this doesn't go the full way of answering the question of suffering. I wish I had the perfect answer for suffering. But we know one of the answers is this. God cares. He cares deeply about those who suffer. And right in the midst of this would be the lie of the serpent. And what is the lie of Satan from Eve till now? God doesn't really care about you. He's holding back on you. You know why you can't eat that fruit? Because God doesn't want you to be like him. You know why he's holding this thing from you? Because he's selfish. He doesn't care. He's distant. He's unmoved by you. And Satan would come along and whisper the same thing to you and me in the midst of suffering. You're alone. God doesn't care about you. Figure it out. And this text, and in the person of Jesus, that is told to be a lie. Because God not only cares, he has a plan. He feels what's going on in the person of Mary, and he's moved. He cares. And our concerns and our fears and our worries have an impact on the unchanging God. And again, I don't know how that all works out. Maybe in heaven we'll understand. Maybe we won't. But again, if there's those in this room that feels like God doesn't care when you go through trials because he doesn't necessarily show up right away the way you want, he doesn't respond in the time frame you think he should, may this story remind us, not only does he have a plan, but he deeply cares and deeply understands suffering because he's God. Now, we move on to the second to last point. Love's willingness to enter into pain. And Jesus is going to say some things. Okay, so he's experiencing a triad of emotions in this text. We're told that he's deeply moved, he's troubled, and he weeps. And in those feelings is also, as I just said, anger. He's angry at what happens here. And for those of us who have lost someone to violence, whether it was self-inflicted violence or violence inflicted on another, unfortunately, I think if you've lived long enough, we're going to have people who take their own lives. We're going to know people who were cut off from this world too quickly by the hand of another. Is it just sadness you experience when that happens? Is there not a sense of anger and injustice that this was not supposed to be? It's different than when we go to the funeral of the 90-year-old woman who lived a full life, raised 3 kids, and has 57 grandkids. When those funerals happen, we celebrate them. If they're a believer, we're like, they're in heaven. Adrian longs to be in heaven. And most of us here are like, we usher you and hope for you to get there as soon as God wills. But when it's the funeral of a young person, that's a whole different ballgame, isn't it? And what Jesus sees here is not just the death of a friend. He has seen and is seeing the effects of sin on the world. It's the taking of his life. Now, again, sin is something that we are born with and we do. And so Jesus sees that this thing with Lazarus is going to happen to every single one of his people. It's going to take us all. It's going to take us violently because we were never intended to walk this path of sin and death in the world. And yet, where does Lazarus find himself? Where every single one of us in this room is going to find ourselves eventually, impacted by death and sin, no matter what we do. And Jesus is angry about that. He's angry. He's hurt, he's sad, and he's angry about sin. Because he also knows that he's going to have to do something pretty remarkable to undo that damage. And again, this raising of Lazarus is meant to point us to something bigger. It's not just the resurrection of his friend. It's his resurrection and the resurrection of us all that he has his eyes fixed on. Because for Jesus, sorry, off with my mic cover. That didn't help. Sorry. Jesus weeps because he knows what he's going to have to do. And one of the things he's going to have to do is be willing to die. And he's called, as we sang in the song, he's called the man of sorrows, familiar with suffering. And one of the things I think we sometimes forget about, there's a passage in Ecclesiastes, and it says this: for with much wisdom comes sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. I want to read that one more time and just think about it from your own perspective. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Is it not true that the more you understand about the world, the longer you live, the sorrow and the grief of life gets bigger? If you've been blessed to have a good childhood when you were little, and you were clueless to how the world worked, and how happy were you? Pretty happy. But the more we know, the wiser we are, the longer we live, the increased suffering. Now let's make the application. How much suffering must God experience if he's the wisest eternal being that there is? So when we are told that Jesus is a man of suffering, we have to, in a sense, look at him as a 33-year-old person about to go to the cross and as the infinite God who's going to have to take the wages of sin upon himself. He is going to suffer. And he understands what the impact is going to be for him. So he's not ignorant to what's going to happen. He understands the cost that it's going to be. And yet, at this time, nobody in his world understands at all what's about to happen. They don't know that in a couple weeks he's going to be crucified by a mob. He knows that, but nobody else does. And for us, we have to kind of put ourselves right in this place because it's almost impossible for us to read the story of Lazarus and not jump to the conclusion, right? Because you all know how this story ends, and so it's very hard to put yourself in the place of Mary and Martha and Jesus, who do not know how it's going to end. So he's removed. He's moved. He has to respond. And so he's waited 4 days on purpose. One of the unique things about Jewish tradition and culture is they believed that the spirit kind of hovered around the body for a while. And so they wouldn't bury you right away, but they would bury you very quickly. And that's still a Jewish practice. They don't embalm the body. They let it sit for a little bit, and then they quickly bury it. And if you lived in the Middle East, and it's April or March at this time, it's hot, it's arid, it's dry, you don't really want that body hanging out for too terribly long. But they did have this tradition of letting the body sit, and then you would bury the body officially. Because there was stories, as we hear even today, right, of people being buried alive. And there was one story from the Talmud or something where some guy was buried for 3 days, and he came back to life and had 5 children and lived another 25 years. So they're like, we don't want to have that accident happen, right? We don't want to see claw marks on the inside of the casket or claw marks on the outside or the inside of stones or something. So they waited, but not 4 days. And so when Jesus says, roll the stone away, what does Mary say? We walked by it just yesterday. It was a bad odor. Jesus, you do not want to open that stone. You don't want to. And maybe Martha's thinking, I don't want your last memory of my brother to be the decaying carcass that's there now. He's not there. That's not him. Let's not do that. But then what does Jesus say? And here's our challenge. Because what's her if? You don't want to do that. He says, but if, here's our last if you believe me, if I really am who I say I am, then you're going to see something amazing today. And so what do? They obey. They roll the stone away, and it probably smelled. And Jesus then makes this prayer. He says this, Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here. And I would add, he says this for the benefit of those sitting here, that they may believe that you sent me, that they may have an absolute confidence that I am exactly who I say I am, so that in a few weeks, when I go to the cross, they'll know something even more powerful. And then he says, Lazarus, come forth. And Lazarus comes hopping out like a mummy, wrapped up in cloths, with a cloth on his face and linen all around him. It must have been quite the scene. But here again is the idea. He's not pointing us to this for Lazarus' sake. Because in the death and in the resurrection of Lazarus, we are to see something about the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And so here's our last 3 points. The nature of decay. The Bible makes this big deal. And if you were reading the Old Testament, I think none of us would have made a big deal about what the New Testament authors do. In the Psalms, I think it said that you will not let your Holy One see decay. And the New Testament authors grab that and they jump all over that. And we're like, what's the deal? You won't let your Holy One see decay. And here's one of the pictures we see. The nature of decay is very apparent, right? This is a picture of a body farm. I didn't just get a random carcass just violently for the sake of violence. A body farm, for those of you who want to do more research, is like this. They take bodies from morgues and stuff, and then they put them in different scenarios to see how they decay so that the police can figure out crimes based on the evidence that they accumulate in controlled environments. So these are body farms. But one thing they know is in this temperature, at this speed, the decay is always going to follow these steps. So that if we find a body in those conditions, we can work backwards and be like, they died 3 months ago, or whatever. Because decay is pretty regular. And here's the sad thing for all of us. If you're under the age of 21, your decay hasn't happened yet. If you're over the age of 21, what's happened to all of us? The decay has begun, right? The decay has begun, and I feel it every day. And that's where Paul comes into this picture where he says, outwardly, come on, someone fill it in for me. Outwardly, we're wasting away. But inwardly, we're being renewed day by day. But here's the effects of sin in our lives. Decay. Decay. So what's this big deal about Jesus not experiencing decay? Because what it's saying is, death had the first word, but not the last word. He experienced death for us. He experienced the power of what that all was going to mean. But he did not experience the decay of death because he's going to conquer it. He's going to be in the tomb not long enough to experience decay from their understanding. Now, obviously, scientifically speaking, decay happens, I'm pretty sure, as soon as you breathe your last. But theologically speaking, Jesus enters into death, experiences the consequences of death, but does not experience decay because in him is life. And for those of us who are non-Christians, we are decaying both physically and spiritually. Sin is hollowing us out and leaving less and less in store for us. But for those of us who are believers, according to what we see in the resurrection of Lazarus here, yes, outwardly we're decaying. And here's the sad thing for Lazarus, like we already talked about last week. What's going to happen to him again? He's going to have to die again. But inwardly, he's being renewed. Inwardly, he's never going to die. Yes, outwardly, his body's going to waste away. He will fall sick to something else in the future and be buried again, but not inwardly. And the same truth is true for us. Because Jesus did not experience decay, we will not experience decay spiritually. We have hope in a future that we can't even begin to imagine because of what Jesus accomplished here. And this is the first sign of the greatest sign of what he's going to do. He's going to resurrect himself and not experience decay, unlike Lazarus. And then he's going to say this in his prayer, in order to bring you glory. And most of the time when we think about glory, or a lot of times we think about the glory of God, we have pictures of sunrises and sunsets and maybe some cool vast picture of the universe, all great, all awesome, all pictures of glory. But that's not the glory that Jesus talks about nearly always in the Gospel of John. What is the glory that he's always referencing? That. His death is always the glory that he's talking about. It's not that sunrises in nature and the universe aren't meant to bring glory to God. We're told they sing the glory of God. But that's not the picture of glory from Jesus' perspective. This event, his life and death and resurrection from the grave, is the glory. Because in that, we see evil is undone, death is brought back to life, and all of creation has an opportunity to have a reverse effect from what sin began in the garden however many eons ago. And in the resurrection of Jesus, history is now going to work backwards. And at some point in the future, he will return and he will take the decay out of the world completely and resurrect his followers. But until that moment, we live in the hope and the belief of what he's accomplished and what he will do. And so this glory, not in winning the Olympics, it's glory in sacrifice, which is a uniquely Christian concept. And last but not least, Jesus is raised to brand new, complete life. One of the things we see about Lazarus is he's hopping out wrapped up in grave clothes. And it says there's a cloth on his face. And what does Jesus tell them all to do? The last thing we read today. Take off the grave clothes and let him go. Right? Take off these clothes and let him go. Because, maybe he had to go to the bathroom. Maybe he wanted to see the sunrise. He did not want to be in that condition. And one of the things I think this picture is showing us is that even when we've been resurrected, the effects of sin are still wrapping us. Hebrews will talk about we need to take off the things that hinder us and slow us down. Take off the grave clothes. Take off the things that are slowing you down. Yes, you're resurrected to new life, but guess what? Sin is still right there, seeking to drag you right back to where you came from. And that's going to be the Christian life our whole life. The taking off of the grave clothes. The things we used to do. The life we used to live. The habits and the patterns and the attitudes that go against the nature of Christ that are still very much trying to win the war against the soul, even though Jesus has brought the victory. And so Lazarus still has a fight ahead of him. But here's the awesome part. When Jesus is resurrected from the dead, where are his grave clothes? They're there in the tomb, and the facial covering is folded up and left because it's done. Done. And anybody who's in Christ will find that final victory. And the victory we find in this life may be very small. We may not see a whole lot of growth over the course of our lives compared to what we know we're called to and what we wish were true. But it is coming to an end of finality. And here's where we conclude. This sermon series began with 1 Corinthians 13:13, right? And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. And why is that the case, right? The day is coming when faith will be sight. I will not have to have faith in Jesus. I will see Jesus. I will not have to have the hope of heaven. I will have heaven. Who hopes for what he already has, Paul says. But if you hope for what you do not yet have, what do you have to do? Wait patiently. We wait patiently for that day. But faith and hope are coming to an end someday for us. We don't need them forever. We need them in this life, but not forever. But why is love the greatest? Because love is eternal. That seed of love that God planted in us when we accepted him and realized what he said is true, that little seed of love is growing in us. And yes, sometimes we go through seasons where it seems to wither and fade. It doesn't seem very green. We don't see a lot of leaves. We don't see fruit. We don't see growth. And there's other seasons where we do. And sometimes we get discouraged by that reality. There's only one little leaf of faith in me. There's only one little leaf of love towards my neighbor. There's only a little bit of this. Shouldn't there be more? But the cool thing is, as we move through this life, that love will grow, because that seed will grow. But it's not like the seed of love just stops growing once we die and pass into heaven. It becomes the tree that we've always wanted. Because love is what heaven is. Love is what heaven is. And it will be the one thing that moves on forever throughout eternity. This is love for us, and our love for him, and our love for each other. It's amazing that God gives us the opportunity in this life to start to experience what heaven is meant to be. And yeah, it's broken, and it's fractured, and we don't do it very well, but the love that God has for us, and the love that he has given us for him, that's the thing that will move through all of eternity and will grow in us through this life and into the next. And so when Jesus does all these things for Lazarus, remember that the goal is not just to think about the miracles in the moment, but to think about what is the miracle telling us about the reality of the world around us. And in the person of Lazarus, we see probably one of the greatest miracles performed as of yet by Jesus, but not as great as the miracle that he will perform a few weeks from that point, when he covers the cost of sin and resurrects from the dead. Pray. Lord, we can't love very well. We can't love the way you love us. But Lord, we just thank you so much that you have not given up on us. Help us, Lord, to love our fellow, to love you, to love each other in a way that is sacrificial and keeps our eyes fixed on you. We thank you, Lord, that you came to earth, that you allowed our hopeless condition to move you to act on our behalf. And in some ways, Lord, may we do that in this world that is in such desperate need. But help us, Lord, to love you and love others.